What's your favourite meme from the last decade? Is it this guy doing that eye thing? Maybe it's the little girl who's side-eyeing you. Could it be Arthur's angry fist? Perhaps it's even Rick-rolling. Well, for a lot of people, their favourite meme has been Sunderland Football Club. For years, Sunderland have been the joke that has just kept on giving, from back-to-back relegations to a documentary covering the whole saga. But in the last 2 to 3 years, this massive football club has been on its way back, albeit with the odd lapse along the way, but we'll get onto that shortly. So I'm Ryan Dilks from the second tier, and this is the story of Sunderland's redemption arc. In 2018, Sunderland would become the first club in 5 years to suffer back-to-back relegations from the Premier League, a feat which we haven't seen since and may not see again for a long time because of the financial power of the Premier League. And despite being amongst the favourites for promotion each season, having the biggest resources in the division and trying several managers along the way, it would take them 4 years to get promoted from League One. When Sunderland were initially relegated to League One, the club seemed to naively expect to bounce back at the first time of asking, because they're Sunderland, a huge club. After a couple of years, it started to realise that wasn't the case. A change in mindset came with the appointment of sporting director Christian Speakman in December of 2020. He had been the academy director at Birmingham City for nearly 10 years and had seen Blues produce the likes of Nathan Redmond, Damari Gray and some lads you may have heard of called Jude Bellingham. When Speakman came in, he would prioritise academy talent and signing young players who they could develop. They would also slowly clear out the players who were on a lot of money at the time. Sunderland would win promotion from League One in 2022, and amongst the players who were introduced into the first team that season were Anthony Patterson and Dan Neil, 2 players from the academy who are Sunderland fans born and raised, Dennis Sirkin, a left-back who they signed from Tottenham as a 19-year-old despite not having played a game of senior football, Trey Hume, a 20-year-old right-back who they signed from Linfield in Northern Ireland for just 200 grand, Patrick Roberts, a winger who had a lot of promise as a youngster but was constantly sent out on loan until he joined Sunderland on a permanent basis, and Jack Clark, another winger who had a lot of promise as a youngster but had a difficult couple of years before joining Sunderland. All of these players are still playing regularly for Sunderland now, apart from Jack Clark, who's just left to go to Ipswich. And all of these players have taken their games to new heights since signing for the Black Cats. Their first season back in the Championship in 2022-23 started off well, but they were dealt an unexpected blow just 6 games in, when manager Alex Neil left to go to Stoke. However, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. Sunderland would appoint Tony Mowbray as their new manager, not only one of the most respected figures in English football, he was perfect for what they needed at the time. A manager who could make them into a stable Championship side and develop the young players they had. What he ended up doing was a lot more than that. Tony Mowbray made Sunderland the first newly promoted team in 7 years to finish in the top 6 of the Championship. All of the players I mentioned a short while ago played starring roles. It also included new signings Dan Ballard, a 21-year-old centre-back who they got in from Arsenal for £2 million, Adi Elise, another 21-year-old defender who they signed from West Ham for £500,000, and Pierre Ekwar, a 21-year-old French midfielder who also joined from West Ham for no initial fee. Again, all these players still at Sunderland now and have taken their games to whole new levels. Also got to give a mention for Amad Diallo, who was sent on loan at Sunderland and played a starring role before going back to Manchester United. But Tony Mowbray had got this team of young, talented players and made them all better footballers and got them in the top 6, playing arguably the best football in the league along the way. It was an astonishing feat. Sunderland would lose in the playoffs to Luton, but the supporters were finally believing in their club again. After several years of being, quite frankly, a laughingstock, the fans felt as if they had a team they could get behind. And the newfound belief continued into the new season, with Sunderland fans hoping for a repeat of the success from the previous campaign. A good start included a 5-0 thumping of eventual playoff winners Southampton and saw Sunderland 4th after 10 games, but a drop-off saw them win just 2 games in 9. Despite that, Sunderland were still sat 9th and 3 points outside the top 6. However, Tony Mowbray was sacked, with Christian Speakman saying, "It was a difficult decision, but we remain loyal to our ambition and our strategy, and felt now was the right moment to take this step." It seemed as if the club felt like this was a great opportunity for them to get promoted, so they needed to make the most of it. And while it wasn't a definitively bad decision to get rid of Tony Mowbray, what followed definitely was. 2 weeks after dismissing Tony Mowbray, Sunderland appointed Mick Beale as their new manager, a man who was best known for saying he wouldn't leave QPR 39 days before leaving QPR, and would well and truly underwhelm at Rangers, where he would be sacked after 11 months, having failed to close the gap between them and Celtic. Now, it's worth saying that Sunderland had been strongly linked with Will Still after Mowbray's exit. Still was one of the most exciting young managers in Europe because of the job he was doing at Reims in France. So when Sunderland turned around and announced Beale, the response was ecstatic. Beale would win just 2 of his first 8 matches in charge, including a loss against big rivals Newcastle in the FA Cup, the only time the two sides have met in the last 8 years. So results weren't going great, and Beale endeared himself even further to the fans with his comments in the media. He would sarcastically criticise supporters, saying, "It's a huge crisis, we're sat at 3 points outside the playoffs. I'm a little bit perplexed and bemused by the outside thing." He would also seem to claim Sunderland fans disliked him because he's Southern, saying, "If it's about the job I'm doing, then it's about the job, but if it's about anything else, I can't change my accent or where I'm from." Sunderland would lose to eventually relegated Birmingham City, managed at the time by Tony Mowbray, ironically. During that game, Mick Beale would also blank Trey Hume after he was substituted off. He would claim he didn't see him, but you can decide for yourself. It would also be reported Beale had lost the dressing room, particularly after he made the players do extra training following a loss while he took the day off. Beale would finally be sacked after just 12 games in charge, which is the shortest reign of any manager in Sunderland's history. The whole thing was an absolute disaster, and while it did substantial damage to Sunderland's promotion ambitions, it did even bigger damage elsewhere. Sunderland fans had complete faith in the decision-making at the club before this, but the sporting director Christian Speakman had never seen his popularity levels so low, and there were calls for him to be sacked. The faith that supporters had in him had completely dissipated. And look, Sunderland are a very passionate fan base. When the fans are behind the team, it's a massive boost, but when they're not, it's a big hindrance. Confidence in Speakman wasn't helped any further by Sunderland putting first-team coach Mike Dodds in charge. He would win just 2 of his 13 games in charge, and they would finish 16th. Sunderland's promotion hopes had effectively been over by the end of March. This whole saga of bad decision-making really set the club back. For the previous 2 years, it seemed as if Sunderland were on the right track, a club really going in the right direction again. They haven't really suffered any setbacks in those 2 years, but for 6 months, it felt like the banter era was back. That's why the summer of 2024 has been a massive one for Sunderland as a football club to decide which course it's going to go on. Despite calls for him to be sacked, Sunderland stood by Christian Speakman as the sporting director, a big call because his position was nearly untenable. The summer didn't get off to a great start either with their search for a new manager. It took well over 100 days to find a successor for Mick Beale. Reports seem to indicate them approaching several managers in that time who turned them down, including, once again, Will Still. They eventually ended up with French manager Regis Le Bris. Le Bris had been head of youth development at French side Lorient, coaching several players along the way who have gone on to have very successful careers, including Mathieu Guendouzi, Ilan Meslier and Enzo Lefebvre. He was made the head coach of Lorient in June 2022, guiding them to a 10th place finish in Ligue 1 in his first season in charge, despite working with one of the smallest budgets in the division. But the following season, Lorient would sell 4 of the best players for big money and not really replace them. It would lead to them getting relegated and Le Bris losing his job. And so he would end up in Sunderland, and while he probably wasn't the first choice, this appointment does make sense. That's mainly down to his work with young players. Sunderland right now have the youngest squad in the Championship. The team which faced Burnley in their most recent game only had 2 outfielders who were older than 23. The midfield 3 has an average age of 19, with Dan Neil, the most experienced of the bunch, at 22 years old. So with Le Bris's record of developing young players, he seems ideal for the job. How good a manager he actually is, we'll find out as the season progresses. So are Sunderland back on course with their redemption arc? The early signs would indicate yes. Regis Le Bris has won his first 3 league games in charge of Sunderland. They sit top of the Championship at the time of recording, and he's done it playing this exciting, pressing football. Usually a manager finds it difficult to implement that style of football so early on. Just ask a certain Baldy manager over in Manchester, but so far it's worked wonders. It's got to be said, Sunderland should have never had the capitulation that they had in the first place. The squad is so full of talent, and I was surprised to see how many people expected them to finish in a similar position to last season. Some even predicted them to finish even lower. But you've got Anthony Patterson, who's an extremely promising young goalkeeper. The fullbacks, Trey Hume and Dennis Serkin, are 2 of the best in the Championship. The defence hasn't conceded a single goal yet, and that's without Dan Ballard, one of the best centre-backs in the division. The midfield of Dan Neil, Joe Bellingham and Chris Rigg is just insane. An average age of 19, all 3 of these lads have the potential to play for England in the future and will at the very least be Premier League regulars at some point. Rigg in particular, at the age of 17, could become an elite midfielder. The attack is where the concerns would lie, but Patrick Roberts looks to be back on form. And look, this video is going out just before the transfer window closes, and Sunderland desperately need to get another winger and a striker. But 19-year-old Eliza Mayenda and 21-year-old Romain Mundle have had fantastic starts to the season. This is an excellent squad. It just needed the right man in charge of it. Le Bris could be that man. It's very early days in the season and we shouldn't get too carried away, but the early signs are very exciting, and a playoff finish would be an amazing accomplishment considering how last season ended. But Sunderland's redemption arc should be back on track. We've got to remember, Sunderland are a gigantic club, arguably in the top 10 biggest football clubs in the country. Only 8 teams in the whole of England had a bigger average attendance last season than them, despite Sunderland being in the Championship. A club with that fan base and history is destined to be back in the Premier League in the near future. And by that time, they will have done a full rebrand of going from a meme to a progressive club, putting faith in youngsters and playing exciting football. Sunderland fans, it's okay to dare to dream once again. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. Make sure you like this video if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more content like this. I'm Ryan Dilks from the Second Tier, and we'll be back again very soon.